Hi, and welcome to the first episode of my Women Workers in World War II podcast. In these 3-episode mini-series, we will explore the idea of the first time women entered the workforce, and I will delve deeper into why I want to talk about this. But first, let's talk about my podcast cover. I bet this photo looks familiar to many of you. Well, to me, it's a symbol of how strong women were at this time of history. Not too long ago, this propaganda was one that was being seen all over the world. But let's rewind a little bit before that, and I know, boring, but I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the time period I want to talk about, just so you have a general idea of what's going on and what's happening. In 1939, Nazis invaded Poland, and this is what we would call the start of World War II, and also known as the Holocaust period. Almost the entire world was fighting in this war, and hence the name World War. This was around the time of 1939 through the years of 1945. World War II had impacts on the entire nationwide. Not just the soldiers involved. Cities were destroyed, governments were corrupted, and countries were barely surviving with the lack of financial resources and materialistic resources they had. With all this horror going on a more personal level, the families and the women were left to tend to their families after their husbands just left. Hence the draft. Men were being drafted into the war, and it was a sad time for families. Fathers, as a result of this, were being taken out of the workforce to go fight for the countries and being sent overseas. Then the families sadly had to sit back and wonder if their husbands' fathers would ever return and survive this war. Not too long after men were being drafted, there was a gap in the workforce that men before filled. This ended up bringing women into the workforce, hence the propaganda I put on my podcast cover. And this caused a rise in women workers all over the world. These women entering the workforce went through hardships, inequalities, and unequal pay. It was a very hard adjustment for them to go through from their societal role as a stay-at-home mother to now a new societal role of a working mother. Honestly, it was uncharted territory for women all around the world. Even still to this day, there are relevant inequalities and unfair treatment from this time period that women in the workforce now are even experiencing. Although it is significantly better now, it's still not equal, and I bet many women in the world right now could say the same thing. I am very passionate about this topic because I know many women in my life personally who still feel undermined due to their gender, and they don't feel completely comfortable in the workplace, when the women in my life are just as capable of doing the jobs that men can do. It is very interesting to me that women entering the workforce about 90 years ago, it still has effects on the women working today. This has led me to spend a semester of my English class researching and delving deeper into this time period and this topic overall. I am very interested in women's studies, which is why I wanted to go into detail about this today. So I thought to myself, I should start from the beginning. I should start when they entered the workforce, in other words, going to the root of the problem, and in other words, telling you that whole history lesson. All in all, my general question is, how did society overall during World War II be affected by the women entering the workforce? I hope you will listen throughout this podcast and see that this is a very complicated question which does not have one simple sentence answer. I think this can honestly be answered in 2 different scopes. One being economically, like a difference in wages, economic improvements when women entered the workforce, and the high demand for women workers. And second being the woman perspective itself, listening to women, them feeling underappreciated, working conditions like factory injuries, and the fight for legislation change in the workplace environment. I hope you continue to listen to this podcast with interest, because you may not think so, but this is just not a World War II issue that I'm trying to give you a history lesson on. This is a present issue, and that's why I think it's important. So if you're going to take anything from this episode, just know that 1939 was the start of World War II with the Nazis' invasion of Poland, and that women were being sent into the workforce because of men being drafted, and this is what started all the problems that women have in the workforce still to this day, and that's why I think it's important to talk about. In my next 2 episodes, I'm going to be talking about, as I said before, the economic effects in more detail in episode 2. And in episode 3, I'm going to be talking about the woman perspective itself. We have to hear and listen to women's voices if we want to understand this problem. And that brings this episode to a complete close, and I will see you to talk about economic effects in more depth.